Joining me now is a former minister in the governments headed by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, Bill Rammell. Bill, thank you very much for coming in.
Delighted.
Migration clearly is a bigger concern to voters than Westminster politicians have been willing to accept for a long time.
I don't think that's the case. If you look at the trend of polls, yes, it's an important issue, but the biggest issues are the National Health Service and the economy. And that's why, and I take nothing for granted, you know, a year is a long time in politics, a very long time. But I think it's looking likely that there's going to be a Labour government, and it's looking likely it's going to be one with a large majority. And I think Conservative MPs are misleading themselves if they think this is just about migration. Yes, the government's got an appalling record on migration, 745,000 net migration, 3.5 times the figure it was under the last Labour government. But it's about much more than that. It's about the chaos of 5 prime ministers in 8 years. It's about the biggest tax burden since the Second World War, and the unfairness that goes with billionaire non-doms paying nothing in tax whilst everybody else is paying more.
Well, the non-dom system has actually been tightened since the last Labour government, as you know perfectly well, and that non-doms are movable so they can go elsewhere if they don't want to pay the tax here.
But they should pay the tax.
But
they should pay
economically, the inheritance in 2010 was disastrous, that the country had run out of money, and then there was COVID, which cost $400 billion. This has all had to be paid for, and I think the electorate understands that. I think the question with immigration is that the Conservatives promised to do something about it and haven't, and that Brexit gives us the power to do something about it, and it hasn't been used.
Well, the inheritance in 2010 was because of the global banking crisis, and we went into that with the lowest debt to GDP ratio of any G7 country. Yeah. So I think you overstate the case. But yes, the Conservatives had broken their word on migration. You know, for a party that was committed to reducing net migration to the tens of thousands, and it's 745,000.
That's very serious.
That's a manifest failure. But they're not serious and practical about reducing migration. It's about, with respect, stunts like the Rwanda bill, which won't work.
But if you look at the detail of the poll in the Telegraph, the YouGov poll, where are the votes going? And a very large number of them are going to reform and to abstention of people who were strongly pro-Brexit and who want things done of what you might call a traditional Conservative type. They're tempted by reform because it's promising what the Tories said they'd do in 2019 and isn't actually happening.
Well, if you look at the history books, this is what happens when you have a change of government. In 1997, huge landslide for the Labour Party, 179-seat majority. We actually took, I think it was 500 or 700,000 votes less than John Major had in 1992. So when parties lose because they're out of touch with the electorate and particularly out of touch with their base, a lot of their supporters stay at home.
And this is very interesting, isn't it, that there's remarkably little direct switching between Labour and the Conservatives or Conservative and Labour. It's differential turnout, and the task for all parties is to get their vote out, which is why the government needs to motivate its base, which is why delivering on something like Rwanda is important, because that's what the base Conservative vote is expecting.
Except I still think, and there are switchers. I mean,
there are some. But,
I canvass regularly in my former constituency of Harlow, and I regularly, every week, come across switchers. But I think politics and elections are still won in the centre ground. And I think if the Conservative Party goes in the direction of just appealing to that narrow base, you'll not only lose, you'll lose even bigger than you otherwise would have done.
Well, it depends how you define the centre ground. If you see this poll, 90% of people want immigration controlled more, and they think it's a tenth of what it is.
I want immigration controlled. This is chaos.
The centre ground is actually for a rigorous migration policy. The centre ground is not for the liberal migration policy we've had for the last 25 years.
But it's for a migration policy that worked. Go back to the last Labour government when I was a minister, and I'll acknowledge before about 2003, 2004, asylum numbers had got out of control. We then were relentlessly focused on reducing the numbers by returns agreements, by processing the backlog, and they'd come down significantly by the end of the Labour government.
Well, but as you know, as you may remember, that the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, then called for that to happen, and the other end of the system, all the resources were taken off deporting prisoners at the end of their sentences. So the balloon was squeezed one way and expanded another. But even more importantly, the numbers coming in from the EU weren't even properly calculated. So we discovered once we'd left that we had 3 or 4 million more people in the country than we'd anticipated. So migration was out of control. It was just a different part of migration.
Those East European migrants were hard-working people who were coming here to do the jobs that were necessary within the economy, and they brought greater economic growth. Now, I recognise that's an argument that's not been well made, but that was the reality of the situation.
If you look at the ABR forecasts for the migration that we're getting, the 700-odd thousand, 1.4 million over 2 years, they say that adds to the total GDP, but GDP per capita is declining, and that the Treasury's study on migration only showed that migrants didn't take more out of the benefit system than they paid in tax. It didn't look at the costs of hospitals and of schools and of infrastructure that is a net cost of migration to the economy.
And you need a balance. Look, I believe that you need some migration to make the economy function effectively. I most certainly do not believe that net migration of 745,000 is sustainable or desirable.
I agree with that. Where do you think it should be?
I think it's difficult to say. Certainly much lower than 745,000, and that's why you need the Migration Advisory Committee with teeth and power to properly recommend what are the skill vacancies that we've got, what are the job vacancies that we've got. You know, the care home sector, where people are at real risk without migrants coming into the country.
Well, up to a point, because we get lots of migrants coming in claiming they're going to work in the care sector, who then go into other employment.
Yeah, going to any care home. My parents ended up in care homes, and they were populated by migrants.
But the care home issue is that we're not paying people enough to work there.
Absolutely, and whose fault is that? Well, we've had a Tory government for 14 years.
They weren't paid more under the last Labour government. It's been a constant problem of social care.
But there's been cuts to the training programme to go into social care, and there's not been effective enforcement. And, we had a national minimum wage. We've now got a living wage. I think the government, the state, needs to take greater responsibility to enforce higher wages.
I think there isn't this group of English people, British people, who won't do jobs. I think they won't do jobs they're not properly paid for. And that we've relied on a drug of cheap immigrant labour that has had very profound consequences for our economy. And unfavourable ones. Unfortunately, I've given myself my last word because I'm just being told in my ear I've got to finish. I'm sorry. Next time you come on, Bill, we'll give you the last word.
Good.